I think I talked about him so much on the air that somebody wrote him down or something, because he's got at least a half a dozen credit cards. You have a $30,000 line of credit, Higgins Hartmann. Really? How much catnip does he need? So then we maxed out our credit cards. And depending on the numbers you're looking at, the average credit card debt in the United States is somewhere between $9,000 per individual and $27,000 per household right now. So then we turned our homes into ATMs, because that still wasn't enough. Wages weren't keeping up, and so we started getting, home mortgages and home loans and things like that. And we went from having equity, like when my dad died, his house was completely paid off and had been for years and years. He'd had a 3% loan on his house. It was good. He had been a veteran of World War II. It was a government-backed loan. And he always thought it was funny how the banks were always trying to get him to refinance, at 4 or 5 or 6 or 7%. He was like, what do they think, I'm an idiot? And he paid that off, and so he had equity. I mean, when he died, he had an estate. It wasn't a big estate. I mean, he bought the house for $15,000 in 1956, and when he died, I think my brother sold it for $110 or $115. But in Lansing, Michigan, you can buy a decent house for that. 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house that we all grew up in, and it seemed fine. It was nice. But the fact of the matter is that the middle class had stuff. They had equity. So in the 90s and the 2000s, it's like, okay, let's take that too. And let's talk everybody into refinancing their house, taking the equity out of their home, because the value of your home is going to go up forever, don't you know? And you can spend that money right now to go out and have pizza and beer. And so we wiped out people's equity. And then they went after people's cars. People used to buy cars, and every couple of years they'd turn them over, and actually what my dad, his scheme was always buy a car 1 year old, and because they did maximal depreciation, and then keep it for 2 or 3 years, and then trade it in for another car that's 1 year old, and it was always like a brand new car. And it worked, but he owned something, right? It had value. And so now, here's this canvas moon, right? We drive down the street, and it looks like, here's all these houses. It looks like people own these houses, but no, this house is underwater $50,000. This house is underwater $30,000. This house has a $200,000 mortgage on it. This one has a $400,000 mortgage on it. That one might be paid off, but that's the rare one, right? And we see all these cars driving down the streets, and we say, oh, look at all those cars. It's just like it was back in the 80s, in the 70s. And no, sorry, almost all those cars are rented. They call them leases. And those people don't own those cars. They don't have any equity. They can't turn it into cash. They can't do anything with it. And the credit cards are kind of invisible. So the whole canvas moon thing, I think, is a really good metaphor, because you can't see how the middle class has been cashed out. And then finally they did the ultimate, in my mind, crime. Thomas Jefferson wrote his own tombstone. He designed it, and he wrote his own epitaph for that tombstone. This was in 1915, 1916. It was a few years after he retired. He was president from 1800 to 1808, 1801, 1809. So in 1814, 1815, somewhere around there, he designed his own tombstone. And on it, he did not put President of the United States. He didn't think that was the most important thing he did. Instead, he put author of the Virginia Declaration of Religious Liberty, author of the Declaration of Independence, and founder of the University of Virginia. The reason he thought that was important was because the University of Virginia was America's first free college. Anybody who could qualify intellectually could go to that college. I mean, obviously there were the restrictions at the time, but by and large, that was the whole point of the thing. Abe Lincoln did the same thing. Jefferson came along after the crash of 1700, Abe Lincoln after the crash of 1857, and after the tail end of the Civil War. Abe Lincoln took giant chunks of land, unfortunately stolen from the Indians, but nonetheless, took giant chunks of land. And I shouldn't say that, funny. I mean, we have to acknowledge those parts of our history, and the same thing with the slavery and Jefferson. But nonetheless, he took these giant chunks of land and said, we're going to create land grant colleges. And enough land was given so that every college could just work that land and people could go to school for free. Michigan State University was one of those land grant colleges, and they still have huge farms and fields and cow barns and pastures and all kinds of stuff. And others, worked the timber and whatnot. And he created more than 50 of these things. In the 1860s, free colleges. He had free college right up until Ronald Reagan became governor of California in the 1970s and said, screw this, these people are I think his verbatim quote is, why should I give free tuition to these punks when they're out calling me names or protesting my policies? So, and then when he became president, that, of course, policy went on steroids. So the final crime that they committed, and again, you know, I'm telling this in a historical perspective, and those of you old enough to remember, it's really important that you be telling young people these stories. That I went to college, I didn't graduate, but I went to college. I went to Lansing Community College and Michigan State University. And I put myself through school working on the weekends as a DJ on WITL, AM and FM, Lansing, Michigan, playing Waylon Jennings. And pumping gas and changing tires and brake pads at the SO station, and working on various days of the week, the dishwasher, the cook, and at the Bob's Big Boy across the street from the gas station. And on one day, when all the waitresses walked out on strike, I was a waiter. And I've been an absurd tipper ever since then, I'll tell you. Great lesson when I was 17 years old. But the fact of the matter is that you could put yourself through college back then working a part-time job. In fact, my mom graduated from college, magna cum laude, from Michigan State University, and she worked, and her father had died when she was 13 years old. Her family was broke. Her mom was the city clerk in Charlevoix, Michigan, and she put herself through Michigan State working just summers up in Charlevoix as a lifeguard. Right? You think you could put yourself through Michigan State today working as a lifeguard for 3 months out of the year? Before Reagan became president, 80% of all tuition expenses in the United States were paid for by colleges, state, and local governments. Now, and 20% was the cost of tuition. Now it's exactly upside down. Now the cost of tuition is 80% of the cost of running a college. And federal, state, and local governments and the college and their endowments are only paying 20%. It's flipped upside down. And so we have done this final thing, and that is to steal the lives and futures of our children, of the people who are in their 20s and 30s who are now having to delay really starting their lives by a decade or two, which has huge impact. When these kids hit their 50s and 60s and 70s, it's going to be very, very different from those of us who are, speaking of myself, I'm 62, people who were able to start their working lives in their teens or in their 20s, and with no burden, no debt burden. And never had to borrow money to go to school, never had to borrow money for basically anything other than a mortgage on a house, and even then it was always, we'll buy this little tiny house, and then we'll buy this little bigger house, and it's like over the years you build equity in that house. And there was no bubble going on then. So that happened. And so that's what happened to the flat part of the line. Now what happened to the top part of the line, because in this gap, of course, there's a mind-boggling amount of money. I mean, there's enough money that the entire middle class would be making $190,000 a year right now if we had continued with CEOs making 30 times what they were making, what their average worker was making when Reagan came into office, instead of the 500 times that they're making right now. So where did all that money go, and how did it get there? Well, it got there, through some pretty straightforward stuff. And this is one of the points of the book, is that there are these cycles that we see in American history, and it's not just American history, you see it all over the world, but in particular in American history. Hang on just a second, I'm going to get a drink of water. Hopefully that's water. Or it's damn smooth vodka. Anyhow, you see these cycles in American history, and basically the cycles are 60 years of figuring stuff out, and then the great forgetting, and then 20 years of stupid. And here's how it plays out, is a crash happens, like in 1929. And, well, actually, what set up the crash was the election of 1920. In 1920, the population the economy had pretty much stabilized since the crash of 1896. And one of the great things that had stabilized it was the top income tax rate was 91%. And government and banks were very heavily regulated as a consequence of the crash in 96. And this was the middle of the progressive era, right? I mean, in 1907, Teddy Roosevelt got the Tillman Act passed, which made it a felony for any business or corporate entity or billionaire to give money to politicians or any political cause. Still on the books, by the way.
Really?
Not so much enforced. court said they didn't like it, but it's still there. So anyhow, and then the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, the 19th Amendment, the women voting, all these progressive things happened during that era. And then in 1920 came Warren Harding, who was that generation's Ronald Reagan, and he said, he campaigned literally on a two-part platform. Number one, tax cuts for everybody, and number two, more business in government and less government in business. That was his slogan. That was the bumper sticker. More business in government, less government in business. And what that meant, everybody understood it, is more business in government. In other words, outsource everything, right? Like we're doing now, with the wars and the NSA and everything else. Outsource things. Let private industry do work instead of government. And deregulate everything. Get government out of business. He became president in 1921. The first thing he did was drop the top income tax rate from 91% to 25%. Wow. Now, what happens when the top income tax rate goes down? Let me just tell you about my own personal experience of this. Again, back to 1976, that year I made more money than my dad did. I made a lot more money than my dad did. We had one particularly mind-boggling year, and our CPA came to us, or at least mind-boggling by my standards, having grown up in Lansing, Michigan. It wasn't mind-boggling by Steve Jobs' standards, I'll tell you. And the CPA came to me and he said, to Terry and I, he says, you guys have to take less money in pay. And I'm like, why? I mean, I just bought a brand new Volvo. That's like, we're living good. And we were paying our employees well. And in fact, my brother was the head of the union in our company, which was not an official union, but they called themselves a union, and they acted like one. But anyhow, our CPA, and he was doing well. But our CPA said, this is crazy. He said, you're paying, 42, 44, I forget the number, 46% in income taxes right now, and you're going to be pushing over 50% in income taxes pretty soon. I mean, the top rate back then was 74%. In fact, it might have been, that was the 60s, it was 91%. So this was post LBJ, so it was 74%. He said, you don't want to be paying that much money to the federal government in income taxes. Take that, you can still take that money, but there's a different way to do it. And the way you do it is you take that money and you put it back into your business, develop new products or improve the products you have, do more advertising to get more market share, improve your relations with your customers, improve the quality of your product, do R&D and develop a new product. And as your company grows over time, the day will come when you can sell that business and you can take a capital gains return on that, which is a lower tax rate than the income tax, and you'll get your money, but in the meantime you will have built this business. And you'll be able to pass it along, sell it, pass it along to your kids, whatever you want to do. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. Ultimately, we were in the herbal tea business, and Mo Siegel with Celestial Seasonings ate our lunch a few years later. But nonetheless, we did what he suggested, and we built that business, and we went all the way up to 18 employees. And it was a good thing. It worked out really well for us, and that's what business did back then. That's how business grew in America. In 1980, and again, those of you old enough to remember, tell these stories to anybody who will listen who doesn't remember 1980 and the years before Reagan. That if you went into any town in America, in fact, Marty Milner used to star on a TV show called Route 66. I don't know if it's still on TV anymore, but Route 66 crossed America from California to New York, I think. And every day, every week in that show, he would be in a different city and he'd have a new adventure. And every city was unique. Every downtown was unique. Every business was a family-owned business. It was named after the town or after the family, and there's all these stories and all this kind of stuff. Nowadays, if you were to drop out of an airplane at 100,000 feet and land anywhere in America, you'd have no clue where you were, right? There's the Olive Garden, there's the McDonald's, there's the Holiday Inn, where's anything that has the town name? Nothing, it's where am I? I don't have a clue. All of America's been homogenized. It used to be malls where all these small businesses, all these local businesses, dry cleaner companies and butchers and bakers and grocery stores and shops were passed down literally from generation to generation in America. Furniture stores, clothing stores, none of that anymore. None of that anymore. Because in 1982, Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act. Jimmy Carter was the last guy to do that when he busted up AT&T. And oddly enough, Richard Nixon had started that. I mean, that's just what you did back then. When business got too big, you broke it up. You didn't let business dominate things. But here we are today, where you've got 5 banks that own assets equal to 65% of the entire GDP of America.
Yeah.
I mean, that's bizarre. There is not a single major industry sector in the United States that has more than 5 companies that own more than 80% of it, whether it's food, entertainment, travel, I mean, you name it. 5 or fewer companies own every sector, and they are not legally and technically monopolies, but they're all operating on a wink and a nod, and they functionally are. And what this does is it prevents entrepreneurialism. It keeps small business out of the marketplace. They give all this lip service to small business, right? But it's just lip service. So why did this happen? Why did this happen? This is one of the great questions that I think people don't understand. They think it's just oh, evil people, right? Or Ronald Reagan was a nasty guy, or that kind of thing. Back in 1951, a fellow by the name of Russell Kirk wrote a book called The Conservative Mind. And this book was the book that animated Barry Goldwater. It animated William F. Buckley. It animated my father. It defined conservatism. And I'm sure it's for sale in this bookstore. It's still in print. And it's actually a pretty good read. I mean, I read it when I was a teenager. And I've gone back and read it since then. And the basic core philosophy of conservatism can be summarized, and liberalism for that matter, can be summarized in the great debates between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. John Adams wanted society to move, after the Revolution, wanted society to move very, very slowly. In fact, he so wanted to emulate the British society that by the second year of his presidency, he had passed a law or a rule that whenever he and his wife, what was her name? Abigail Adams. Whenever he and his wife came through any town, that the local militia had to line up on both sides of the street, fire their guns in the air, and shout, "Long live President Adams," because that's what the British did when the Queen came through town. And Thomas Jefferson thought this was crazy. He famously said you would not expect a man to wear the clothes that he wore as a child. He suggested that every 19 years, every generation, there should be a revolution in America. Not a shooting revolution, but every generation should define, the life is to the living. I mean, he wrote it at some eloquent length about this, and it's quoted in the book, in fact. And that's the progressive perspective. And the conservative perspective is change is fine, but do it slowly, gradually, test everything, don't make any mistakes, be conservative. And the progressive was, hey, let's try this. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. But let's keep getting better and better as fast as we can. Right? And so we've been having that debate for a long, long time. And in The Conservative Mind, Russell Kirk begins with the story of Sir Edmund Burke. Sir Edmund Burke, in fact, the whole first chapter is devoted to Sir Edmund Burke. Sir Edmund Burke was the guy. He was a British historian, economist, philosopher, with whom Thomas Paine spent a week back on his way to the French Revolution to get arrested. He didn't realize it at the time. And he got so PO'd at Burke by these 2 weeks that he spent at his home. He was so upset about this that he wrote literally an entire book rebutting Burke. That book is also in print in this bookstore, and you can find it here in Powell's. It's called The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. And one of Burke's most famous quotes, one of the ones that I really remember well, and I'll give it to you in the more modern English version, because the original is 18th century English. But he said basically, "It does me no harm if a man is allowed to engage in a profession as servile as that of tallow maker, candle maker, or hairdresser. But it does society," see what he was saying basically was, the lower classes, what John Adams referred to as the rabble, should not be allowed to vote or run for political office. He said, but it does society considerable violence if such a man is allowed to participate in governance, to vote or to run for political office. And this was consistent, frankly, with the Protestant ethic. It was consistent with this idea that we're all born sinners, because Eve ate that apple and we all came out of a woman, and therefore we're all, there's something